Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Optimal Health for Busy Entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Julian Hayes II, back at it again with another fascinating individual who is talking about a subject that we have not really talked too much about on the podcast just yet. But just to give a little backdrop and intro for him is that, we live in a time now in which more than 100 million Americans suffer from a neurological illness. Not only is that number expected to rise, and the annual costs to care for people with neurological disorders is expected to surpass $1 trillion. That is a lot. At this time, $1 trillion is about the equivalent of the entire crypto market, just a random fact. But the impact of these illnesses on our lives is unlike any other. Neurological disorders affect every single fiber of our being, from physical, psychological, emotional, and cognitive impairments. They rob us of our lives. They rob us of our families in a way that diseases of other organs cannot. And so oftentimes it seems that we are helpless to do anything about it. This is part of the introduction of my guest book. And my guest, I'm talking with none other than Dr. Philippe Douyon, and he's a board certified neurologist. He's one of the hosts of the Brain Profits podcast, and he's the author of Neuroplasticity, Your Brain Superpower. Change your brain and you change your life. So without further ado, how is it going today, sir?
Oh my God, it's going so good today. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining me. I'm so glad that we got connected and everything. When one of the sentences, I read that was part of from your book, and it was also though that the brain produces the outcomes that we're experiencing. That one line can mean so many different things. From a scientific level, of course, different neurons in the brain, but even just from the way we perceive the world and our mental thoughts, is that this is going to shape our world. So, before we even get into that, what's your origin story?
So my origin story is that I am born and raised in New York, grew up playing competitive sports, playing tennis, and a lot of people thought I was going to be a professional tennis player. Went to college on a tennis scholarship, and then the first week in college, as I'm doing my physical in order to be able to compete, I failed my physical. Right? And they weren't sure why, what was going on. So they were like, hey, don't worry about it. Come back in a week. We'll retest you and you should be fine. Failed it a second time. But then they were kind of like, you know what? You've got a big tournament coming up. So even though you failed your physical, go ahead and play this tournament in this little town in Pennsylvania. So I go play this tournament. And as I'm playing one of my matches, I go up to serve and my entire body goes into one big cramp. And I collapse to the ground and I cannot move. And I am laid out on this cold, hard tennis court for the next hour, completely unable to move. And then they finally call EMS. They take me to the hospital. And a week later, I am diagnosed with kidney failure. And so that was how I started off my sort of college career. And I went through college and medical school in kidney failure. And then 8 days after graduating medical school, I was blessed and I received a kidney transplant from my father. Right. So that is my origin story. And so even though people will see that, yes, I am Dr. Douyon, I am also a patient and I've been a patient my entire adult life. And so that has changed the way that I look at the world, changed the way that I look at life. And it's made me a much, much better doctor.
I was getting ready to ask that question, that you've had the unique perspective of being both a patient and a person who takes care of the patients, and I'm sure that is giving you unique insight. So I guess what's been one of the biggest, how's that made you a better practitioner?
Yeah. So the reality is that I know what it feels like to experience your mortality, right? To have to face your mortality. I know what it feels like to look in the mirror and not recognize who you are anymore, to take a whole bunch of medications that you have side effects with, and to be uncertain about the future at a really young age, to be uncertain, whether or not you're going to live in a time where you're supposed to feel invincible. Right. So I get it when patients come in and they're uncertain about their future and they're feeling incredibly vulnerable. And so I get to relate to patients on that kind of level. And that really helps me to sort of move the needle with them. And it's not just about prescribing a pill here and there. It's really about getting to the root of what's going on in their life and helping them to transform their health as well as their life.
Yeah. So when we think about kidney failure, and my father had kidney failure. He was on dialysis for around 11 going on 12 years before he passed. And he was diabetic, though. And so oftentimes I think when we think about kidney failure, we think about, diabetics often having that problem. But what are some other reasons that someone may have kidney failure?
Yeah, so in my reason, it was autoimmune. So my body, for whatever reason, was attacking my kidney tissue, right? Certainly, you mentioned diabetes is one reason, high blood pressure is one reason. So we're looking at a lot of reasons that are essentially preventable chronic diseases or lifestyle diseases.
Yeah. So the autoimmune, that would be more like a genetic thing, right? And so,
Yeah, it certainly could be.
mhm.
Yep.
And so you had two transplants, right? You
Yep,
had one
two
just last year
transplants.
as well.
I had one last year. So, sort of the nature of organ transplantation is that sometimes your body will reject it long term. That wasn't necessarily the case for me, but the original disease process sort of came back. And I was in the process of starting to get kind of worked up for a future kidney transplant when COVID hit. And I was kind of like, damn, like if I get this virus, like I probably am not going to survive, right? So I need to do like a hard quarantine. And about a year into COVID, somehow I contracted the virus. I ended up in the hospital for 2 weeks. It completely wiped out my kidney function. And then I had to face what at that time was my biggest fear, was going on dialysis. Right. And the reason that was my biggest fear was because everybody that I had seen in the hospital on dialysis always looked like they were waiting to die. So
Mhm.
when they told me in the hospital, like, look, you're going to need dialysis, right? I got in my feelings. I let myself feel that, and I cried for probably what was it, a good hour or so. And then I was kind of like, you know what? I need to decide how I'm going to do dialysis. I need to do this my way, not the way that I've seen other people do it. Right. And so when I was on dialysis, I traveled on dialysis. I used that time certainly for rest because dialysis does take a physical and mental toll, but also used it as time for personal and professional development. I had a local news agency following me. So I was taking like videos and pictures in dialysis, which
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure they were not happy about. But I decided to do it my way.
Mhm.
Right. And that allowed me to get through.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with dialysis because you mentioned that people are just waiting to die. I think the average person is on dialysis for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
And then, yeah. And so my dad doubled that. And I think one of the reasons why is because of his attitude. And he still found ways to joke and laugh. Even if you're on this thing, he went 3 times a week and
Yeah.
about 3 to 4 hours. And I think just having that attitude, even in less than ideal circumstances, can really help you so much. And it sounds like that's what happened in your case there.
Absolutely. Look, we're all going to face things in life, but what matters most is the way that the decisions that you make in terms of how you're going to face that. And so we know that in healthcare, people who have really sort of positive outlooks on life, regardless of what they're facing, are going to do better than people who have negative outlooks.
Mhm.
Right. And so having that positive mental attitude is crucial to be able to overcome and get through what it is that you're facing.
Yeah. And I think that's a great segue right there into taking a deep dive into neuroplasticity and neurons, because that's essentially what you're doing there in that instance. For listeners and let's start at the beginning here. For listeners who aren't as keen and knowledgeable about this, what exactly is neuroplasticity?
Yeah, so neuroplasticity is all about your brain's ability to adapt, learn, and heal. It's about the fact that our brains are making new neurons and new connections. And so for a really long time, we thought that our brains were kind of stagnant, that the only thing that could potentially happen to it is that you lose neurons along the way because of, you get like dementia or maybe you have a head trauma. But we now know that that's not the case. We now know that our brains are constantly evolving, right? They're constantly making new neurons, especially when you give it what it needs in order for it to do so. And so we create neurons with every new thought that we have, certainly our level of physical activity, new things that we're learning. So we're able to make new neurons our entire lives.
And so how does so if that's the instance for listeners who hear that and they're like, okay, so you're telling me I can literally change the way my brain is going to operate.
Absolutely. And the reality is the fact that our brains are capable of changing, what makes that really special for me is that that means that we're capable of changing as
Hmm.
individuals, as a community, as a society, right? Um, and we're in control of how our brains change.
Now, when I went through your book a little bit, and I saw that you had different sections related to neuroplasticity, things from anxiety, stroke, epilepsy,
Yeah,
Parkinson's, MS, depression, addiction, and memory, and I think even exercise, right?
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so literally every single thing is, and so let's start with probably one that a lot of people can relate to, especially over the last few years. I've noticed that people are a lot more anxious and just tense, and
Yep.
I think the pandemic, like, I think people were already on edge a lot and just tense for maybe work or the everyday life, and then I think the the pandemic and everything just like threw gasoline on it
Yeah.
and just really magnified this. So I just noticed that people are just a little more on edge now. So how is neuroplasticity and anxiety connected?
Well, think about this, right? The reality is that the last couple of years have been significantly stressful, okay? And stress taken to a completely different degree is trauma. And so we can say that the last couple of years have been traumatic for people, right? We've watched our loved ones die. We've watched people get really sick, not knowing how they're going to do. People have lost jobs, right? They've had to figure out how they're going to feed their families. That is incredibly traumatic. And your body and brain have a way of responding to stress and trauma. And there are chemicals that get released, right? And those chemicals increase your blood pressure. It essentially puts you in a fight, flight, or sort of freeze state. So it revs up your sympathetic nervous system, right? Increases your blood pressure, increases your heart rate, increases your breathing. Well, that also has an impact on your brain. And what we know is that when people are undergoing a lot of stress, you get a huge release of cortisol. And cortisol in the brain wants you to focus on what that stressor is, right? Because nothing else matters. So one of the examples I often give is if a lion walks into your room, that's going to be incredibly stressful, right? So your brain wants you to focus on that, focus on every detail of that lion in order to enhance your survival. You need to know what the posture of that lion is, whether it is growling at you, whether it's coming towards you, right? Uh, the drapes in your room do not matter in that moment, right? And so you may not remember when you're telling this story a couple of weeks from now, you may not remember why you were even in that room to begin with, but you'll remember every detail about that lion. And so when we're undergoing a significant amount of stress, we're actually not making new memories. We're just focused on the stressor. And so we can see that stress and trauma actually kills neurons in the part of the brain that's responsible for making new memories. And so when people are just focused on trauma, right, that's going to make them feel anxious, right? That we already said, you know, their heart rate and their breathing rate goes up. These are all symptoms of anxiety. Anxiety may start in the brain, but it's got physical manifestations.
Mm. Yeah, and oftentimes you hear that too. And I think about myself in very stressful moments, and I thought about, I go back to my dad's passing, and I think the weeks after and even beforehand, if, to a certain extent, starting to feel stress, and I noticed mine was more of like an acid reflux, and that's how my manifestation showed up. Whereas some people's physical manifestations show up, and it's more, maybe it's, with their joints or some kind of inflammation going on, and so it shows up differently for us. And I think that's
Yeah,
truly amazing about the human body, that everything is connected. And I think
yeah,
that's kind of an issue that we forget sometimes, is that we tend to place different illnesses and chronic illnesses in silos, and we don't look at it as a whole system, but we like to separate these things.
yeah,
And so another one I'm curious about is, uh, I think, and we touched on it a little bit, was neuroplasticity and memory.
yeah. And certainly, like we just mentioned, a lot of people come to me and their big worry is that they're going to get Alzheimer's, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, Alzheimer's is a form of dementia, which means that you're going to lose some of your cognitive abilities, right? Your ability to communicate well. Certainly, you'll have some memory loss. One of the biggest myths when it comes to things like Alzheimer's and dementia is that your lifestyle has nothing to do with it. And in fact, your lifestyle has everything to do with whether or not you're at increased risk of developing Alzheimer's or another dementia, right? So high blood pressure, diabetes, those have a negative impact on your brain over a long period of time. That puts you at risk for dementia. Whether or not you're getting enough sleep at night, right? That puts you at risk of dementia because in the deeper stages of sleep, that's when your body is clearing, your brain is clearing itself of the toxins that have built up throughout the day, right? And so doing things that are going to help keep your brain healthy, help your brain make new neurons and new connections, like getting enough sleep, getting into those deeper stages of sleep, that's going to be crucial. Exercising on a regular basis, that's going to be crucial. Eating healthy foods that are not going to cause widespread inflammation, including inflammation in your brain, that's going to be huge, right? So the reality is that we have control over what we're at risk of developing as we get on into our later years.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that is one of the people's biggest fears. So I do genetic testing and as one of the things for like an assessment. And people are always curious to learn about the ApoE4 gene
Yep.
and so I'm sure you hear about that a lot too. And people, I always tell them that it's none of this stuff is a guarantee. None of this stuff is an absolute. All this stuff is probability. Some of us have higher probability than others, but it's still not an absolute. And that we still have a lot more control over these things than we think we do.
Right. One of the things I tell people is, well, how is that going to change your life? If it comes back positive, what are you going to do? And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, well, the things I'm going to tell you to do are supposed to be the things that you do whether or not that gene is positive or negative.
Exactly.
So it's kind of irrelevant at that point, right? You just need to live a healthy life.
Yeah. And the difference is really between someone who would have a higher probability for that and who doesn't. It's really in the minute details. Like 90% we're all going to eat the same. So I think people get a little nervous about these things, and and then that goes with the anxiety, and now you start to, so these things, it's like a huge cascade effect. And so, what are some of the traps and what are some of the traps and pitfalls of our brain? Things that you see most probably leaders and high performers that you tend to work with at times. What do you see with them?
Yeah, so it's first, teaching people that they are not their brain. Okay, the fact that we are aware of our brain, that we're aware of our thoughts, suggests that we are a much higher power than our brain. Okay, and that's why it's going to be so important to actually take charge of your brain. I often compare our brains to like a 2-year-old throwing a tantrum, right? Like, have you ever had that moment where sort of if somebody upsets you in the moment, okay, and it could be like 2 minutes, all of a sudden you start being like, well, not only do I hate this person, but look at everything that's wrong in my life. Look at everything that's wrong in the planet. Human beings suck. This country sucks. Like it just takes you down this like really negative sort of spiral, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reality is if you're not taking charge of your brain, that is what's going to happen. Because our brain's tendency is that it wants to enhance our survival. And so it's going to lean towards the negative, right? But oftentimes that holds us back. And so taking charge of our brain really allows for us to create the health and the life that we want for ourselves.
So this requires a great deal of a consciousness in a sense, because our brain is for our survival. This is the thing of why do we want to stay in our comfort zones? Why do we not want to take chances? Because our brain is hardwired for survival. It's ultimately why me and you are speaking today. It's because our brain is hardwired for safety, and it keeps us fairly not doing dumb things, even though I don't know, I've done my share of dumb things, but but for the most part, it keeps us safe, and realizing that we are not our brain. And I think that's a good way to look at these things about illnesses. And I think you did that too when it came to the time for dialysis and the kidney transplants as well, is that you are not your illness. This illness is a thing, but it's not you. And so it's dissociating that identity. Is that what you're thinking?
Absolutely. One of the things that I see a lot of patients do is that they really strongly identify with their illness. And one of the things that I actually talk about in my online course is, do we do a disservice by giving people a diagnosis? Because then they sort of take that diagnosis and it becomes their identity. So I'll give you an example. So I'm a neurologist, but I'm also an epilepsy specialist. So I take care of a lot of people with seizures. And there was this patient, we had gotten him seizure free, hadn't had a seizure in more than 6 months, just coming back for his follow-up, right? So I'm talking to him, I'm like, hey, what have you been doing? Have you been working? And he's like, no, I have epilepsy. And I'm like, Yeah, but you haven't had a seizure in more than 6 months. So are you just waiting for the next one? Right. And it's because he was so wrapped up in that diagnosis that he could not exist outside of that.
Mm.
And for me, my whole history with kidney disease, it's just like a chapter in the book on the life of Philippe Douyon. And it may not even be a whole chapter. It might just be a few pages, right? Because there's so much more to who I am. And so I think people really need to not identify with whatever label somebody else gives them.
So why do you think people have a hard time dissociating from these identities? Oftentimes you hear people say, I'm tired of being sick. I'm tired of being sick. I'm tired of, you know, put it whatever you want in that fill in the blank. But yet
Yep.
they still are clinging to that identity.
Well, I think it's the words that we use, right? So one of the things that I often say is are the verbal embodiment of power. The words that we use create the life that we live. And in medicine, let's say somebody who's got epilepsy, we call them an epileptic, right? Um, like it's we sort of give them that label, and it becomes who they are, and they really take that in, right? So even when I was on dialysis, I would take my two sons out to play basketball. And one day, one of my sons said to me, playing basketball, and he was like, something about me being sick. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm kicking your butt right now in basketball. Like,
Mhm.
right? So it's the words not only that we use, but certainly the words that other people around us use.
And so I imagine in your online course, and it's all about what. Actually, let's go into that a little bit. What exactly is the main mission of this course?
It's really about teaching people how to become the leader that their brains need them to be in order for them to create the health and the life that they want for themselves. It is teaching them how to hack their brain. And so the course is really divided into four parts that kind of build on each other. And the first is really about the importance of having a mission, vision, and purpose in your life and the impact that that has on your brain. Right? Then the second part is about all the things that impact your brain, all the things that you do every single day that impact your brain. The third part really sort of focuses in on actions that you can take to become the leader that your brain needs. And then the fourth part is what I think is the secret to life. So you know how people are always like, man, what is the meaning of life?
Hmm.
Well, for me, the meaning of life is evolution, and not evolution of the species, but evolution of the individual. And I take them through how they can evolve as individuals in order for them to create the health and the life that they want.
Besides the identity part, where we're having trouble dissociating from ourselves from whatever ailment we have, um, what are some other like pitfalls or common occurrences that you see people in the course and people that you work with one on one when it comes to optimizing and hacking their brain?
Yeah, so it's really about the thoughts that they're having, right? So somehow they came up with this number that we have anywhere between 12,000 and 60,000 thoughts every single day, right? 90 to 95% of those thoughts are the same exact thoughts people had yesterday. And then we wonder why their lives aren't changing. 60 to 70% of those thoughts are negative, right? So we wonder then why people aren't happy um, with the lives that they are living, right? It's not just about the thoughts, it's also about the people that you surround yourself with. You know how they say, like, if you are around five rich people, you're going to become the sixth rich person.
Hmm.
Or, when we're growing up, it's like, don't hang out with that bad group because then you're going to become, a bad kid also, right? The
Right.
reality is that we have a group of neurons in our brain called mirror neurons. And those neurons help us to mimic the action of others. And so if I scratch my nose, you're more likely to scratch your nose. But it's not just that they mimic the actions of other people. Those neurons actually start firing at the same frequency as the people that we surround ourselves with. So we start being just like they are,
Mm.
right? So we've got to have new thoughts. We've got to surround ourselves with different people. We have to have new experiences. All of that will help people to grow.
So you become your community, you become your environment.
Absolutely.
Hmm. Yeah, I totally relate to that. I totally get that. Especially if you think about fitness, and health. I did not come from a particularly healthy background. Probably wasn't up until probably college, where I started to try different foods. I had a salad and just things like that. I had baked chicken instead of just always fried chicken.
Yeah.
And just because someone asked the question, have you tried this, or would you consider this? Just posing a different question, because like you said, every day we have the same messages, the same way of doing things on repeat.
Right.
And and our brain is efficient. And this is another survival mechanism, I assume, right?
Absolutely, right? Like you want to learn things. So like when they talk about muscle memory, it's not actually muscle memory. It's that your brain has gotten so good and efficient at doing that. That connection, that network in your brain is incredibly strong. And so it doesn't take a lot of work.
Mm. So it sounds like what are a couple things that listeners can do today when it comes to taking the initial steps to optimizing their brain?
Yeah. So I would say be very mindful of what you are taking in, right? What you're taking in on the TV, what's the news that you're listening to, what you're scrolling through on social media, what you're reading. All of that is going to impact your brain and impact the thoughts that you are having. So that's one thing that you can do today. Certainly exercise. And exercise doesn't mean that you are going to the gym, right? Exercise can be, if you're somebody who loves to dance, find a way to dance 3 or 4 times per week. It's about moving your body, right? Go for a moderate intensity walk, right? Have a conversation with somebody who doesn't have the same background as you do and maybe doesn't have the same beliefs as you do. Doesn't mean that you have to adopt what their beliefs are, but at least that will help you make new neurons and new connections and help you to relate to other people better. So there are things that people can do every single day, right? Like you mentioned about food. Eat something different, healthy, right? Because that's going to have a significant impact. Try to get 6 to 8 hours of sleep per night so that your brain can get into those deeper stages and clear out the toxins that are building up throughout the day. So there are things that people can do every single day.
Yeah. I wrote an article maybe a year or two ago about optimizing the brain a little. And I actually wrote about dancing. And I forgot the study. I wish I could remember off the top of my head, but I think they had a group of, I think they had Parkinson's maybe, or early onset. And they were learning the tango, Argentine tango. And they did this a couple of times a week, like you mentioned. Yeah. And that neuroplasticity, they started to rebuild neurons.
Yeah.
And those symptoms lessen.
Right.
And I found that fascinating, because when we think about exercise, we just think about lifting weights, or we think about maybe running, 5 or 6 miles or so. But something as simple as just getting your body in motion is all it takes to really start rebuilding those neurons and maintaining those neurons as you age.
Absolutely. And particularly with Parkinson's disease, right? So not only is the exercise important because that does allow your brain to make new neurons, but also when people think about Parkinson's disease, they think about it in terms of it being just a movement disorder. And it is a movement disorder, but it's also a disorder of motivation, because dopamine, which is the chemical that goes down in Parkinson's, plays a huge role in our motivation and reward systems. And so exercise that combines sort of a target, something that's going to motivate the person to move, is going to be huge. Whether it's dancing, or one of the big things in Parkinson's is shadow boxing, right? Because you give the person a target that increases their motivation to move, and that really helps them.
I didn't think about that. So with dopamine, I guess the go-to source for, I guess, how do you suspect someone has low levels of dopamine? Is that something that you have to measure, or can you?
No, so yeah, it's part of their history and the physical exam, right? So Parkinson's, a lot of people, when they think of Parkinson's, they think of like the person has a tremor. And so yes, a tremor is part of it. Their muscles don't move as fast, so their face almost starts looking like a mask, and they're very slow in terms of their movements. They may be very, very stiff. But what people don't realize is actually symptoms of Parkinson's start long before, right? So the person's writing may change. Their writing may get a lot smaller, right? The person may start having difficulty with their smell years before they develop some of the other symptoms of Parkinson's. Or they might even develop something like constipation years before. Now, I know a lot of your listeners are going to be like, well, I'm constipated, right? So
Yeah,
just
yeah. I
being
think a
constipated,
lot of people will think that just, oh, I'm constipated.
right?
So
So that doesn't mean that you have
yeah.
Parkinson's, right? But
Mhm,
it's about the entire sort of story of the person and putting it together. So just because you have one symptom does not mean you have Parkinson's, right? If you're
mhm.
constipated, drink a lot of water. Like,
Yeah. Man, I remember just during my time in medical school, right? I remember reading about some of these diseases and everything, and then I would come down with like a cough, or I
yeah,
would like my throat is itching, and it wouldn't be just like I have a head cold or I have a just a sore throat from the air or anything. It would be like, oh man, do I have this random running out of this random disease all of a sudden now
hmm,
because you started to just read about this stuff all the time. And so you just started getting these things in your head. Like every time I still to this day, every time I see like a rat, I think of Yersinia pestis. I think of that
yeah,
just random thing. I cannot get it out of my head.
right, yeah, and this happens to a lot of medical students, right? But
Yeah.
this tells you how powerful the brain is,
Mhm.
right? And so think about the last couple of years where, the focus has been on the pandemic and COVID.
Mhm.
Like, I'm a doctor, so I know how viruses behave. But man, when I got COVID, because I was so focused, like I knew everything about COVID at that point. I knew all the numbers. And a couple of weeks before I got COVID, I remember looking at some news organization, and they were like 300,000 people were diagnosed with COVID today. And I thought to myself, oh my God, that's going to be, I mean, that like, there's only like 300 million people in this
Yeah.
country. So eventually everybody's going to get COVID, right? 2 weeks later, I got COVID. And and part of me feels like I attracted that to myself because I was so focused on it.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
y that happens a lot. I
Yeah.
think that happens a lot because what you're telling, you can speak life or you can speak death. In most people case, you can speak illness or you can speak
Right.
what the thing you don't want, which is why, because the thing you say you don't want, you're actually focusing on it, so you're going to get more of
Exactly.
what you focus on. So it's kind of like a paradox that I'm still learning to this day, to be very mindful of how I speak about certain things,
Yeah.
because they do come to fruition. And I think that's a lot of case where you just manifest this thing
Uh,
somehow. And I that because I'm shocked, when during the peak of all of this, where you hear so many people. I heard a lot of people say, I don't want to come down with it. I don't want to come down with it. And next thing I know, hey man, I'm gonna have to quarantine for a little bit. I
right.
think I have it. So I
Yeah.
think what I said was like, if I come down with it, I come down with it, but my body's resilient, it'll be able to handle it.
Yeah.
And we'll go from there. And
Yeah.
I think though that, speaking with the COVID thing, now anytime you hear someone cough or something, people are kind of like, they're still just they're a little on edge and everything. And I think that's just, what do you consume a lot? Going back
Yeah.
to what you said moments ago, where what we consume, we ultimately become.
Absolutely. And like you said, like I had said before, words are the verbal embodiment of power. What
Hmm.
you speak is what you end up creating. And if all you're doing is talking about illness and things you don't want in your life, well, that's exactly what you're going to manifest.
So what ultimately attracted you? Why neurology?
So for me, it was when I was growing up, I had a cousin who had epilepsy and she ended up growing out of it. And then I had a grandmother who had Alzheimer's disease. And even though those are devastating disorders to certainly go through, but also to witness, there was that part of me that was kind of like, man, when the brain works the way that it's supposed to, it is this incredible organ, right? And so as I've learned more, and look, I'm a neurologist, so when I see patients, which is maybe like 10 times a month at this point, I'm seeing people who have disorders. But the knowledge that I've gained over the last few years about how we can actually really use our brains, and I'm just like, wow, that is the part of us that is most godlike, because
Hmm.
that is the part of us that allows us to create the life that we want.
And do you think that kind of information is is missing in terms of, I kind of like, just during my brief time, and I think you can speak on this more, is that I think the curriculum is a little too heavy just on the science portion and not that kind of stuff that you were just mentioning. And I think if they started to bring in a little of that, I think you would create a world of better care, better practitioners, and even better outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, our healthcare system is all about sick care, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
all about disease, disorders, and pills. And that is what the focus is on. And I do think that we need to shift our focus and really focus on the well-being of people and everything that goes into that, right? In order for people to truly live fulfilling lives, they need to be physically fit, they need to be mentally fit, they need to be spiritually fit, and they need to be financially fit.
Mm-hmm.
In my professional and personal experience, you need all of that for a healthy human being. You can give them whatever label you want, right? But if you're not addressing all those things for them, it doesn't even matter.
Yeah. Yeah. There's always going to be something. And it's like trying to, if you had a boat and you got 4 or 5 holes on it and you try to just only look at 3 of those, you're still going to sink eventually because too much water is going to get in on the other 2.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so what was the motivation behind writing the book? How was that process, actually? I wrote a book eons ago now. I think it's been about 5 or 6 years, and I've been doing a very good job of procrastinating on writing another one.
Yeah. So for me, it was about patience that inspired me. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It was about writing something sort of in layman's terms that they could sort of understand, that would be inspirational and motivate them, but as well as teach them about some of the power that they have. And so that's really what inspired me to write the book.
Yeah, and so did you, during the process, I just love to, sometimes people just, it's smooth sailing throughout the whole book process. And then some people, it's like, oh my goodness, what did I get myself into? But then in the end, you're still happy for it. So which side of the coin were you on?
So I feel like, so I'm somebody who believes in God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I literally feel like that book came from God because, there are moments in life where you are super motivated to do stuff and you're like, how did I do that? Right? Like there was one time I moved myself out of an apartment all by myself, moved couches and beds all by myself, right? Got the truck all by myself. And looking back, I'm like, how did I do that? Right? The book was something that I wrote within 2 or 3 months. Even when I was working 100 hours a week, I'm like, how did I do that? Right. And I just remember feeling that sort of inspiration to just get it out, and for me, that's something that came from God.
Yeah, they got me thinking, actually. I do think, though, there's inspiration and then there's that type of inspiration where I think
Yeah.
that's it's almost sort of like a divine inspiration.
Yeah.
Because I think everyone can probably look back on certain moments in life or certain feats, whether it's like, man, I was working 3 jobs to get this business going, or I almost was going to have to, it was almost going to go under if I didn't get this one deal this week and everything. And it's almost like this divine work from God that happens, and you can't explain it. Just like this book just came to me in just a stream of conscious,
Yeah.
and so with those things you just can't explain.
Yeah.
You can feel it, and somebody who's in tune and has actually experienced something like that, they had the same thing. It was just like, yeah, it just happened. Because that's how I felt about my book a little bit. It's just that things just came out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then sometimes when I go back and I'll read it or read a part of it, and I'm like, man, that was really inspirational.
Mm-hmm.
Like that line was super inspirational. Like, where'd that come from?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you got another one that you're thinking about in the future?
Listen, I already have the outline done. I've
Awesome.
got the title. I've, have the format. So yeah. So gonna be starting to work on that soon.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to take some of your inspirational energy because I have titles. I have like 2. I have titles and everything, but I just have not really started just with the outline or anything. And so I'm probably telling myself a story since we're on this thing. I'm telling myself an actual story right now.
Yeah,
Of
then you
life.
just
Yeah.
need to change the story that you're telling yourself.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
So as we get ready to kind of wrap this up here, what's your health and wellness routine looking like these days?
Oh, so my best days, I wake up, and then I sort of look in the mirror and I've got affirmations that I will tell myself. I will then meditate. I will exercise, and that is all before that I start my day. And no matter what happens the rest of the day, I feel like I have accomplished so much already.
Hmm.
Right. And throughout the day, like I've got, even when I'm in the shower, I've got things that I tell myself, sort of positive affirmations that I tell myself. And when I need them throughout the day, I will remind myself of those things. I've even recorded myself going through my affirmations. It's like a 9-minute recording. When I'm in the car, I will play that as a way of, reminding myself of what I am capable of and who I am. And so it's really about being incredibly mindful of just the way that I treat my body and my brain. I stopped actually listening to the news
Hmm.
as soon as I got COVID. Dude, and it's been great. I don't know what's going on in the world, but it kind of doesn't even matter. Like you pick up snippets here and there, right?
Yeah. I still, to this day, I still think it's the strangest thing when I think it was CNN. I'm not sure if the other news stations had it, but they had like this running tally on the side of the thing. They were during the whole broadcast of just like, people, positive cases and like deaths and stuff. And
Yeah.
you just kept seeing this ticker go up and up
Right.
as you're watching it live, you know. So I couldn't. I mean, are we really surprised that people are a little on edge?
Right.
If you just watch that and this thing is going up like it's a
Mhm.
scoreboard at a basketball game or something, and you just keep seeing the number go up and up and up. So I don't know. That was a very crazy thing. I think they've taken it down at some point. I think I don't really watch the news myself. If it's really important enough, when I'm walking around, I'll hear it,
Right.
and then if I need to know about it, I might do a little researching into it. Other than that, I'm you know I'm kind of like you.
Yeah.
I can't really change those things. And if you're going to change the world, I believe changing the world really starts with changing yourself.
Absolutely.
So, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I don't know on that one. It's a weird world. But
Yeah.
so what are 2 to 3 books that have made a huge impact on your life?
Oh my gosh. So I would say certainly Think and Grow Rich
Hmm.
was one of
Classic.
them. Classic book. I have always been a big fan, and I've read this book probably more times than I've read any other book, 100 Years of Solitude, um, which the author is
No
Gabriel
way.
Garcia Marquez.
You're a Gabriel Garcia Marquez fan.
Oh my God, dude.
Oh my
I
goodness.
went through a
Oh my
phase where
goodness.
I literally read all his books.
Oh my goodness.
Like
I'm a fan as well.
I have like a library, and this is, I mean, this was years ago, so it's in like my parents'
Hmm.
maybe attic, but it's like a library of his stuff. So big fan of his. Um, Actually, and I just read. Have you ever read the book The Four Agreements? I just finished that book.
I have. Hmm.
It is a very good book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a fifth agreement. I don't know that one. I just stuck to the original.
Yeah.
I'm afraid of sequels a lot of times because they typically are not as good as the original. So
Or yeah,
so
he's got a few other books actually. After reading that one, I just finished it a couple days ago. I ordered a couple more of his books.
yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, Gabriel Garcia though, I love his writing style. It annoyed one of my friends. He's a big because of you can really like one page can just be one sentence because
Yeah.
and it's just like this excessive run-on sentence, and I love that. I tried to get away with it when I set it in for edits, and
Yeah.
I explained that, hey, look, I was like, look, I'm a fan of Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
No.
He did this, and she's like, well, this is a different kind of book, and yada yada yada. So it had to be cut down into like 12 sentences instead of just the one long continuous one. But I tried it. I tried it.
Listen, I mean, his writing is so descriptive. I feel like you just picture what is going on in that moment,
Yeah,
right? And
it's a
so I
special
think
talent.
it's beautiful. It's amazing.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
I need to read more fiction, and
Yeah.
that's something. But I always find so many interesting nonfiction books that I run out of time for fiction books.
Listen, I'm always like, if you've got $10 left and you spend it on a book, that is a good investment.
Hmm.
Like, books allow us, I mean, think about this, right? So whether it's your book or my book, it is based on the experience people have accumulated over years.
Hmm.
And you could gain that knowledge within hours. Like, that's incredible.
Yeah. I think a big part of my life before I had actual mentors that I could talk to in person about that were, at places that I am working to be, I had virtual mentors and mentors in these books,
Yeah.
and that helped me. And so that's because someone asked me, well, what if I have an environment right now that I don't like and I don't have anyone around to talk to or anything like that? Well, it's like you have a book, you have audiobook, and you have YouTube now.
Right.
Yeah, podcasts.
Yeah.
And those things can at least get you in the right mental space for when you do come across those people. And kind of like we talked about earlier, when you're thinking these things constantly all the time, you're going to attract those things at some point.
Yeah. I 1000% agree. Right. So you have access to people all around the world. Right? You have access to their knowledge, to their perspective. You can read all their material. You can watch all their videos. And then if you're lucky enough, you'll be able to meet them in person.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely. And so the last question here is that pretend you got a bottle of wine, you got some tea or some coffee or some water, whatever your beverage of choice is that you want to have at the table. And there's 3 extra seats there that can join you. What 3 people from history would you have join you for a roundtable discussion? They can be dead or alive, but they have to exclude family.
Okay. So the first 2 that come to mind, Barack Obama and Arthur Ashe.
Okay.
Okay. Who is... And I'm going to pick Mother Teresa.
Okay. Barack Obama, Mother Teresa. Okay.
And Arthur Ashe.
Typically, all those guys at some form are healers, I would say, to a certain extent.
Yep.
And you're in a profession that obviously is about healing.
Yep.
And I believe Arthur Ashe had illness. Yeah, he had illness and everything, and
he contracted HIV/AIDS through a blood transfusion back in the 80s.
Yeah. So, and this question usually gives you insight into who the person that you're talking to is, and so that's why I love asking this question. Because it usually matches up with what they're doing, as a vocation or a career, and also kind of like where they came from. And so, because it sounded like a lot of times I think when we do enough investigating, we can see that our childhood typically determines our career trajectory in some form or fashion.
Oh, I would agree with that. Like, essentially, you know how people say, like, I have to find myself, or they feel like they've lost themselves? I feel like the reality is that we are a product of everybody who's put thoughts into our heads. Parents, family, teachers, society, right? And finding yourself, quote unquote, because I don't really think you lose yourself, but finding yourself is really about clearing your mind of all those thoughts that people have put into your head and figuring out what are your own thoughts.
That's the hard part, because to do that means to face yourself and to sit in silence and be by yourself. And I think in today's society, it seems that is one of the most difficult things that people have a struggle with. As we saw over the last 2 years with the pandemic, you saw some people who had to be by themselves and couldn't escape. And it was difficult for them.
Yeah, well, give me peace and silence, and I'm like loving life.
Yeah, well, 100 Years of Solitude is one of your favorite books, so I mean, it shouldn't be too much of a struggle. But I've enjoyed this conversation, and I think listeners are going to get a lot out of this. So, where can listeners find out more about you?
They can find me on social media. So Instagram, the handle is Philippe.md. They can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook. They can certainly go to my website, InleBrainFitInstitute.com, INLE BrainFitInstitute.com.
All right. And I will have all that in the show notes in case you guys are listening or running right now and you're not getting on YouTube to watch this. So, so once again, thank you. And the listeners out there, stay awesome, be limitless. And as always, never stop upgrading. Peace.